Sunday had begun like so many others in Oldbrook. The sky, still covered by a light mist, enveloped the stone streets and colonial rooftops with an almost ceremonial calm. In St. Jerome's Church, Father Thomas Anderson prepared the altar for the 6 o'clock morning Mass with slow, reverent gestures. His movements revealed the habits of a life dedicated to faith, shaped by prayers, rituals, and silences. "Father, we're out of holy water," announced Samuel Wilson, the 60-year-old sacristan who had served the church for more than 3 decades. His thin face and knotted hands seemed to have been sculpted by time along with the church walls. "Thank you, Samuel. I've already taken care of it. It's in the office," replied Thomas, without interrupting the meticulous organization of his vestments. Gradually, the wooden pews were being filled. Mrs. Margaret Davis, first as always, took her usual place in the 3rd row. Her perfectly arranged white hair and the blue rosary wrapped around her fingers were as much a part of the routine as the colored stained glass windows that filtered the rising light. "Good morning, Father Thomas," she greeted with a gentle smile. "It's going to rain later. I can feel it in my knees." "Your knees never lie, Mrs. Davis," smiled the priest, "but we'll still have a beautiful celebration." The Mass began punctually. The voices of the small choir echoed softly through the nave as Thomas conducted the liturgy with the familiarity of someone who knew every word, every gesture, every pause. He had been serving this parish for 15 years and sometimes had the impression that the very stones of the church breathed with him during prayers. "The Lord be with you," he intoned, with his hands open to the assembly. "And with your spirit." The faithful responded in unison. That's when the noise began. At first almost imperceptible, as if it were part of the distant town waking up. Then clearer and rhythmic, a heavy, measured sound that echoed off the century-old walls, hooves on stone. A murmur of confusion ran through the pews. Heads turned toward the entrance as the sound grew louder. In the main doorway of the church, framed by the golden morning light, appeared the imposing silhouette of a buffalo with dark, shining coat. The silence that took over the environment was so dense that one could hear the beating of a moth's wings. The animal entered slowly, its steps echoing in the central nave. There was no sign of agitation or nervousness in it, only a kind of silent purpose that impressed even more than its unusual presence. "My heavenly Lord," whispered Mrs. Davis, pressing the rosary against her chest. The animal advanced down the central aisle while the faithful squeezed into the pews, divided between fear and astonishment. Father Thomas remained motionless, his hands still suspended in the interrupted gesture of blessing, as he watched the buffalo approach with solemn calm. The animal stopped before the altar and looked directly at the priest. Its dark eyes, of an almost mystical depth, fixed on Thomas's with a disconcerting intensity. In the stunned silence of the church, there seemed to be a mute communication between the two. "Don't be frightened," said the priest, finally finding his voice. "It doesn't seem aggressive." "It's a sign, Father," murmured Samuel, with wide eyes. "It has to be a sign." Thomas took a few cautious steps toward the animal, which remained motionless, just observing him with that enigmatic gaze. There was something about the buffalo, a presence, a consciousness, that transcended mere animal condition. "Who does this animal belong to?" someone asked from the back of the church. "Nobody raises buffalo around these parts," answered another voice. After a few minutes of mutual contemplation, the animal slightly lowered its head, as if in reverence, turned around and walked with the same solemnity out of the church, leaving behind a trail of amazement and speculation. The tea. News spread quickly through the narrow streets of Oldbrook. Before the end of the day, there were different versions about the size of the animal, its behavior and the meaning of its visit. Some spoke of an omen, others of a miracle, and there were those who swore the buffalo had tears in its eyes when it faced the priest. That afternoon, as the rain predicted by Mrs. Davis fell gently on the colonial rooftops, Father Thomas sat in his small office in the parish house, trying to find some meaning in the extraordinary event of that morning. Through the window, he observed the empty and silent church under the rain, while a new and inexplicable restlessness settled in his spirit. Something had changed that Sunday. What was once a serene routine of devotion now seemed like the beginning of an unknown path. And somewhere, in the misty hills that surrounded the historic town, a buffalo with a profound gaze carried a secret that still waited to be revealed. The weeks passed in Oldbrook with the intensity that only great events create. In bakeries, pharmacies, and even at the Thursday market, the subject was the same: the buffalo of St. Jerome's Church. The stories grew with each retelling, gaining increasingly fanciful contours. "I heard the animal spoke to the priest," commented Gerald, the produce shop owner, while weighing half a pound of eggplant for a customer. "Spoke in Latin, no less." "What nonsense, Gerald," retorted Mrs. Davis, who was waiting her turn. "I was there and nothing like that happened. What happened was a connection, something different. That animal has an ancient soul, you can feel it." It was Mrs. Davis who first suggested the name that would eventually stick. "To me, it's a female. And if she's female, she deserves a respectable name. I'm going to call her Clementine, like my grandmother." The name spread quickly. Soon the whole town was talking about Clementine, as if the buffalo were a local personality, a celebrity that had emerged from nowhere to shake up the routine of the historic town. On Saturday afternoon, Father Thomas received an unexpected visit at the parish house. Dr. Mitchell, a retired veterinarian and respected figure in town, knocked on his door with a concerned expression. "Father, I've come to talk about this buffalo," he announced, sitting in the chair offered by the priest. "People are creating absurd legends. I know, Doctor. I've been trying to calm everyone down, but I confess that even I was impressed with the animal's behavior." The veterinarian cleared his throat, adjusting his thick-framed glasses on his nose. "I've been observing this buffalo for a few days. It appeared in the region about 2 weeks ago. It's a rare specimen, Father. An Indian buffalo, not very common in the United States. The most intriguing thing is that it doesn't show signs of having escaped from a farm or breeding facility. It's well-nourished, with no rope marks or any sign of recent domestication." "And what do you suggest?" "Nothing for now. I just came to let you know I'm keeping an eye on it. If it appears again, call me. I want to do a more detailed evaluation." The following Sunday, the church was packed. People who hadn't attended Mass in years showed up, driven more by curiosity than devotion. The buzz was constant, and Father Thomas had to ask for silence several times as he prepared to begin the celebration. "They came to see the buffalo show," Samuel commented disdainfully, while helping the priest dress for Mass. "This isn't right." "God works in mysterious ways, Samuel. If he needed a buffalo to bring people back to church, who am I to question?" Exactly at 6 o'clock, when the priest was pronouncing the opening words of the Mass, the familiar sound of hooves on stone echoed again. A collective sigh ran through the assembly. Clementine entered with the same solemnity as the previous week, her measured step resonating in the expectant silence. "It's her! It's Clementine!" someone exclaimed. And the name was repeated in murmurs throughout the church. This time, however, something was different. Upon reaching the altar, the buffalo didn't just stop to observe the priest. She knelt, bending her front legs in a posture that seemed like a deliberate reverence. The faithful gasped. Some people began to cross themselves frantically, and an older lady fainted, being supported by neighbors in the pew. Father Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. There was an intelligence in those eyes, a consciousness that deeply disturbed him. It wasn't just an animal acting on instinct or coincidence. There was purpose there. "Welcome back, Clementine," said the priest, surprising himself with the words that spontaneously left his lips. The buffalo blinked slowly, as if in recognition, stood up and walked to a corner of the church, where she sat quietly, like a common faithful attending the celebration. The Mass proceeded in a surreal atmosphere. The priest tried to maintain the solemnity of the rite, but it was impossible to ignore the impressive presence of the animal, which remained quiet until the end, observing everything with solemn attention. When the celebration ended, Clementine stood up and calmly left, leaving behind an astonished congregation and an increasingly intrigued priest. "This isn't normal, Father," commented Dr. Mitchell, who had been present at the Mass. Buffaloes don't behave like this. Something very strange is happening. At the church exit, a group of more excited devotees was already talking about a miracle. Some wanted to touch the buffalo, as if it were a sacred relic. Others were frantically taking photos with their cell phones. The video of Clementine kneeling before the altar went viral on social media before noon. In the afternoon, Bishop Arnold called, visibly displeased. "Thomas, what's this story about a buffalo in your church? I'm getting calls even from journalists in New York." "It's true, Bishop Arnold. It happened exactly as they're saying. The animal came, behaved in an extraordinary way, and left." "You need to control this, Thomas. The church isn't a circus. If that animal appears again, call animal control." "With all due respect, Bishop Arnold, I can't do that. There's nothing threatening about its behavior. I'm sending Father Michael on Tuesday to evaluate the situation. He'll be your assistant for now." When he hung up the phone, Father Thomas felt a weight in his chest. He knew Father Michael, an ambitious and inflexible young man recently returned from Europe, with whom he had never had a good relationship. His arrival would certainly complicate matters. That night, as he walked through the churchyard under the starry sky of the Virginia mountains, Thomas saw a shadow moving among the trees. It was Clementine, silently observing him from a distance. The priest made a beckoning gesture, and to his surprise the buffalo slowly approached. "What do you want to show me, Clementine?" whispered the priest, cautiously extending his hand to touch the animal's muzzle. The moment his fingers touched the warm, rough skin of the buffalo, Thomas felt a strange connection, as if an invisible current passed between them. And in that instant, he had the absolute certainty that Clementine wasn't just a lost animal. She was a messenger, a guide to something he still couldn't understand, but that would forever change the course of his life and of the small community of Old Brook. On Tuesday, a fine, persistent rain fell over Old Brook, enveloping the colonial buildings in a shroud of mist that seemed to suspend the town between past and present. Father Thomas was in the sacristy, organizing parish records, when he heard the sound of determined footsteps on the stone floor. "Father Michael," he recognized without having to turn around. "Bishop Arnold said you would arrive today." "Father Thomas?" The voice was young but carried a calculated formality. "I hope you're ready to resolve this peculiar situation." Thomas finally turned to face the newcomer. Father Michael Hayes was only 35 years old, but his gaze already showed the rigidity of someone who doesn't admit contradictions. Tall and thin, with impeccably combed hair and a cassock without a single wrinkle, he emanated an authority that seemed disproportionate to his age. "There's no situation to resolve, Father Michael, just an unusual occurrence that's being interpreted in various ways by the community." "A buffalo in the church isn't just unusual, Father Thomas," replied Michael, pronouncing the word with slight disdain. "It's inappropriate and potentially dangerous. Bishop Arnold is concerned about the diocese's reputation." "The animal hasn't shown any aggression." "Still, we can't allow a church to become a tourist attraction because of a wild animal. If it appears again, I'll take measures." The rest of the day passed in a silent tension between the two priests. The news of Father Michael's arrival spread quickly, and there were already rumors that he had come to end Clementine's miracle, as some people were already calling the phenomenon. The next morning, a grey and damp Wednesday, Father Thomas entered the empty church for his morning prayer and found Clementine already inside. The animal was in front of the altar, insistently scraping the floor with her right hoof. "What are you doing?" asked the priest, cautiously approaching. Clementine raised her head, fixed her deep eyes on his, and returned to scraping the floor, with more vigor this time. Thomas knelt to examine the spot. The animal's persistence had removed layers of old wax and dust, revealing something carved in the stone. "My God," whispered the priest, running his fingers over the engraving. It was a symbol, a circle with intricate lines in its interior, forming a pattern that vaguely resembled a compass rose, but with elements he didn't recognize. The sound of a door slamming made Thomas rise quickly. Father Michael was entering the church, his eyes widening at the sight of the buffalo. "What's happening here?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the empty nave. "She was here when I arrived," replied Thomas, instinctively positioning himself between the young priest and Clementine. "This is unacceptable. I'm calling animal control right now." "Wait, please," asked Thomas, extending his hand. "Look what she discovered." Reluctantly, Father Michael approached and observed the symbol exposed on the floor. "What is this?" "I don't know. I've never seen it before, and look, I've been in this church for 15 years. The young priest examined the symbol for a few moments, his expression oscillating between distrust and curiosity. "It looks old, probably from the time of the church's construction." "Maybe. But why would it be covered? And why did Clementine insist on revealing it?" Father Michael straightened up, adjusting his cassock as if the gesture helped him recover his authoritative posture. "This is ridiculous. You're attributing human intentions to an animal. It probably was just scratching its hoof on the floor." "You didn't see how she looked?" "At me, how she guided me here," insisted Thomas. "I'm concerned about you, Father Thomas. This fixation isn't healthy. I'll suggest to Bishop Arnold that you take a few days of rest." After Father Michael left, Thomas turned his attention back to Clementine, who remained impassive, observing him. "What do you want to show me?" he asked again, caressing the animal's muzzle. "Who are you, Clementine?" That same day, during the afternoon, Father Thomas began to rummage through the old parish records. Samuel, who was helping him bring down dusty boxes from the sacristy attic, showed himself increasingly apprehensive. "You shouldn't be messing with this, Father. These are old things. Better to leave them alone." "Why the fear, Samuel? They're just historical documents." "Not everything that's old should be disturbed," replied the sacristan, nervously rubbing his knotted hands. "There are stories in this church that are better left in the past." This statement only increased Thomas's curiosity. Among yellow documents eaten away by time, he found mentions of a renovation of the church carried out in 1994, an apparently simple work to repair damage caused by water infiltration, but which, curiously, had cost much more than expected. "Do you remember this renovation, Samuel?" The sacristan became visibly tense. "I do. It was when they replaced the floor of the central nave." "The entire floor? But why? Wasn't it just a problem of infiltration in the walls?" "I don't remember exactly, Father. It was so long ago." In Seoul, a particularly deteriorated folder, Thomas found a list of parish employees from that time. One name caught his attention: Lucy Montgomery, catechist. The name was circled in red, with a notation in the margin: "Dismissed, 08/12/1994, exactly the period of the renovation." When he showed the document to Samuel, the old sacristan turned pale. "Did you know this Lucy Montgomery?" "No, I don't remember her," stammered Samuel, but the tremor in his hands betrayed his nervousness. "It was before my time." "Samuel, you've worked here for more than 30 years. That was only 27 years ago." The sacristan muttered something inaudible and quickly moved away, leaving Thomas intrigued by his reaction. That night, the priest dreamed of the symbol found under the altar. In the dream, the design pulsed with its own light, and Clementine was at his side, guiding him along a path that extended beyond the church, through the streets of Oldbrook to an old house on the edge of town. When he woke up, covered in sweat, he had the certainty that he needed to find more information about Lucy Montgomery. The next morning, Thursday, Thomas went to the municipal registry office. The employee, a friendly lady named Mary, who knew the priest well, showed herself willing to help him. "Lucy Montgomery? Yes, I remember her. A dedicated young woman, worked in catechism, but she disappeared suddenly. No one knew where she went." "Did she have family in town?" "She had an aunt, Mrs. Antonia, who lived on Blossom Street. But the poor woman passed away many years ago." "And the house? Do you know if it still exists?" "Of course, that blue house with white windows at the end of the street. It's been empty for years. They say Lucy left it to the church in her will, but no one ever officially took possession." Upon leaving the registry office, Thomas felt a chill. The house that Mary had described was exactly the one he had seen in his dream. As he walked through the narrow cobblestone streets, reflecting on his discoveries, he caught sight of Clementine calmly grazing in a vacant lot. Seeing him, the Buffalo raised her head and fixed on him that penetrating and meaningful gaze. "You're showing me the way, aren't you?" murmured Thomas. "You know what happened to Lucy Montgomery." The answer came in the form of a deliberate movement of the animal's head, so similar to a human nod that Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. The truth was beginning to take shape, connecting the hidden symbol, the mysterious renovation, the unexplained disappearance of Lucy Montgomery, and the enigmatic presence of Clementine. It was as if the past, silenced for so long, finally found a voice. The silent voice of a buffalo that, somehow impossible to explain, seemed to carry the secrets of St. Jerome's Church. The house on Blossom Street seemed frozen in time. The blue paint, once vibrant, peeled on the exterior walls, and the white windows were clouded by the dust accumulated over the years. A small garden, now overgrown with weeds, still preserved the outlines of beds that once must have housed colorful flowers. Father Thomas hesitated in front of the rusty gate. Technically, if the house had been left to the church, he had the right to enter. But something in the air of abandonment of the place seemed to reverberate with silent warnings. "Father Thomas?" The voice startled him. It was Mrs. Davis, who was passing down the street with a shopping bag. "Mrs. Davis, you startled me. What are you doing around here?" "I should be asking you. You're looking at Mrs. Antonia's house with such a strange face. Did you know the owner of the house?" "Of course I did, and her niece too, Lucy. Such a dedicated young woman to the church. A shame she left the way she did." "In what way, Mrs. Davis?" The elderly woman adjusted her shawl over her shoulders and lowered her voice as if afraid of being heard. "Out of nowhere, Father. One day she was there working in catechism, all excited about the preparations for the feast of St. Jerome, and the next, she vanished, left everything behind. Some said she ran off with a boyfriend, others that she entered a closed convent, but no one ever heard from her again." "And the aunt? What did she say?" "Mrs. Antonia never believed that her niece had left of her own free will. She fell into depression, poor thing. Spent her last years looking for Lucy, writing letters to convents, hospitals. She even hired a private detective, but it led nowhere." Thomas felt a knot forming in his throat. The story was becoming darker with each new piece of information. "Do you have any idea why she might have disappeared?" Mrs. Davis looked around, as if checking if they were alone on the street. "Lucy had been agitated in the last weeks before. She vanished. She mentioned to me that she had discovered something serious, something about the church, but she never said what." "And you didn't ask?" "Of course I asked. She said she was gathering evidence, that she wanted to be sure before talking to anyone. She scheduled to talk to me after Friday's novena, but she never showed up." Thomas thanked her for the information and said goodbye to Mrs. Davis, promising to visit her later to continue the conversation. As soon as the elderly woman turned the corner, he returned his attention to the house. Now, more than ever, he felt that he needed to enter. The gate opened with an ominous groan, and the sensation of being watched accompanied him to the porch. The church key worked in the old lock, confirming his suspicion that the property really belonged to the parish, although he had never heard of it before. The interior was immersed in dimness and smelled of mold and abandonment. Furniture covered by dusty sheets looked like silent ghosts, witnesses of a time abruptly interrupted. In the main living room, a bookshelf with books and photo frames still preserved the essence of those who had lived there. In one of the photographs, a young woman with curly hair and a luminous smile hugged an older lady, certainly Lucy and a Mrs. Antonia. In the small office at the back of the house, he found shelves with religious books, catechism materials, and a dark wooden desk. In the central drawer, locked, something seemed to catch his attention, as if an invisible force guided his instincts. He forced the lock with a small letter opener he found on the desk, and after a few seconds, the drawer yielded. Inside, wrapped in a faded red velvet cloth, was a leather-bound notebook with the initials LM engraved on the cover. Lucy Montgomery's diary. With trembling hands, Thomas opened the notebook. The first pages contained routine records of the life of a dedicated catechist. Lesson planning, reflections on biblical passages, notes about her students. But from the middle of the diary, the tone changed drastically. June 15, 1994. Today I found something strange while cleaning the parish archive. Documents from the St. Michael Foundation mixed with donations for the church renovation. The figures don't match. There's a difference of almost $100,000 between what was announced to the community and what appears on the official receipts. I need to investigate more. June 22, 1994. I went to the registry office to verify the foundation's records. I discovered that the president is the same contractor who's doing the church renovation, and the vice president is the mayor's cousin. Strange. Even stranger is that, according to the papers, the foundation received a huge donation from a foreign company for preservation of the religious heritage of Oldbrook. But there are no details about this company. July 3, 1994. Today I accidentally overheard a conversation between Father Vincent, Thomas's predecessor, and the contractor. They were talking about the need to hide everything well and change the entire floor so that nobody suspects. When they saw me, they abruptly changed the subject. I'm afraid, but I need to find out what they're hiding. Thomas turned the page, his heart racing. The next entry made his blood freeze. July 10th, 1994. I discovered it. I can't believe what I found. Under the altar, when they lifted it for the renovation, there's an ancient symbol carved into the stone, the same symbol that's on several documents of the St. Michael Foundation. Father. Vincent wanted to cover it with the new floor, but the contractor said it was better to preserve it, just hide it. I didn't understand why. They also talked about other places in town where the same symbol appears. They mentioned a map and something about a valuable artifact. I took photos of the symbol with my camera. I'll develop them tomorrow and show them to the history professor at the university. July 11th, 1994. Someone entered my house today. Nothing was stolen, but my things were rummaged through. The camera film is gone. I'm scared. I called the Professor, but he's traveling, won't be back for 2 weeks. I don't know if I should talk to the police. What if they're involved too? I need time to think. Maybe it's better to go away for a few days. The last entry in the diary, dated August 12, 1994, was brief and disturbing. I found more information. The symbol is linked to an ancient secret society that operated in Virginia during the colonial period. They hid something of unimaginable value in Oldbrook, something that should never be found. Father Vincent knows this, and now he knows that I know. I no longer trust even my own shadow. I'm going to hide everything I discovered in a safe place. I know they're watching me. I left clues with Thomas. He'll know what to do if something happens to me. My dear companion, so loyal and silent, my only true confidant in these dark times. Thomas. Closed the diary, feeling dazed. Who was Thomas? The name didn't appear in any other part of the diary. Was it a boyfriend, a friend? Someone who might still be alive and know Lucy's whereabouts? A sudden sound at the back door startled him. He quickly put the diary in the inside pocket of his jacket and walked cautiously toward the noise. When he opened the kitchen door, he came face to face with Clementine, who was looking at him fixedly from the small backyard. "How did you find me here?" he whispered, extending his hand to touch the buffalo. That's when a revelation hit him like lightning. He mentally reread the last words of the diary. My dear companion, so loyal and silent, my only true confidant in these dark times. Ising. I wasn't possible. It was too absurd. And yet... Thomas, he murmured, looking directly into the buffalo's eyes. Are you Thomas? The animal slightly tilted its head and blinked slowly as if confirming. Thomas felt the ground disappear beneath. His feet, the connection between Lucy and the buffalo, the knowledge the animal seemed to have about the church's secrets, its appearance exactly now, so many years later, everything was beginning to make a disturbing and impossible sense. You're helping. Me find her, concluded the priest, his voice barely above a whisper. You know what happened to Lucy. The buffalo snorted softly, as if in assent, and turned to leave through the backyard. At the doorstep, it stopped and looked back, as if waiting for Thomas to follow. The priest understood the message. The mystery of Lucy Montgomery, the symbol hidden under the altar, the secrets of the St. Michael Foundation, everything was connected, and Clementine, or rather Thomas, was willing to guide him along the path of truth, no matter how strange or dangerous it might be. Friday morning found Father Thomas in his office, deep circles under his eyes evidencing a night of insomnia. Lucy's diary, hidden among his personal belongings, seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, as if the secrets contained in those yellowed pages demanded to come to light. "You look worn out, Father," commented Samuel, bringing a cup of strong coffee. "Didn't sleep well?" "I have a lot to think about, Samuel," replied Thomas, carefully studying the sacristan's face. "Have you ever heard of the St. Michael Foundation?" The old man visibly paled, almost dropping the cup. "Why do you ask that, Father?" "Curiosity. I found some mentions in the old parish archives." Samuel nervously adjusted his shirt collar, as if it had suddenly become too tight. "It was a charity organization, if I'm not mistaken, helped finance restorations of churches in the region. I don't think it exists anymore." "And do you remember who ran it?" "No, I don't recall. It was so long ago," he replied evasively, quickly heading for the door. "Excuse me, Father, I need to check the bell. I think there's a problem with the clapper." Thomas observed the sacristan leave hastily. The reaction only confirmed his suspicions. Samuel knew more than he admitted. Determined to discover more about the mysterious foundation, Thomas took his car and drove to the town hall. The imposing structure, a restored colonial mansion, housed the town's historical archives in the basement. He knew the archivist. Well, Martha Reynolds, a former parishioner who frequently requested his help for organizing cultural events. "Father Thomas, what a pleasant surprise," greeted the middle-aged woman, her red-framed glasses standing out on her angular face. "How can I help you?" "I need to research an organization that existed here in the 90s, the St. Michael Foundation. Do you have any records about it?" Martha's smile subtly faded. "St. Michael? Yes, I have something. But why the interest?" "I'm organizing a book about the history of social work in Oldbrook," he improvised, "and this foundation appeared in some parish documents." Martha led him down a narrow staircase to a refrigerated room where metal shelves held boxes identified by periods and subjects. "Non-governmental organizations. 90s, here," she murmured, pulling out a heavy box. "I'll leave you alone, Father. If you need anything, I'll be upstairs." As soon as he was alone, Thomas dove into the documents. The St. Michael Foundation had been officially registered in 1990, with the declared purpose of preserving the historical and religious heritage of Oldbrook through philanthropic actions. Among its founders, he found familiar names: Anthony Matthews, the contractor mentioned in Lucy's diary, Robert Allen, at the time deputy mayor, and to his surprise, Father Vincent Miller, his predecessor at St. Jerome's Church. A financial report detailed donations received from national and foreign companies, with significant amounts directed specifically to archaeological studies in religious sites. The foundation had sponsored renovations in 5 historical churches in Oldbrook between 1990 and 1995, including the renovation of St. Jerome's mentioned in the diary. A curious detail caught his attention. In all official documents, the foundation's logo included a stylized version of the same symbol he had found under the altar, the circle with intricate lines. However, here it was presented as a historical compass rose, symbol of the pioneers. In a separate folder, he found newspaper clippings. One of them, dated January 1995, announced the sudden closure of the foundation's activities. The official justification was fulfillment of its mission and redistribution of resources to other social initiatives. There was no information about where the resources might have gone, or what these other initiatives would be. Another clipping from a small local newspaper contained a short note about the death of a foundation employee in a domestic accident. The name of the employee wasn't mentioned, only that she was a young woman dedicated to social causes, who worked intensively on St. Michael Foundation projects. The date of the clipping, August 14, 1994, 2 days after the last entry in Lucy's diary. Thomas felt a chill. He discreetly took out his cell phone and photographed the most important documents. When replacing the folder in the box, he noticed a small label at the bottom, almost imperceptible. Complementary documents archived separately. See restricted collection. When Martha returned to check if he needed anything, Thomas casually asked about this restricted collection. Those are sensitive documents, Father. Unresolved legal proceedings, ongoing investigations, that sort of thing. They remain under the direct responsibility of the Secretary of Administration. And who is the current secretary? Dr. Claude Matthews. Matthews. Any relation to Anthony Matthews, the contractor? He's his son. The Matthews family has been in local politics for generations. The puzzle was beginning to form in Thomas's mind. The family of the contractor mentioned in Lucy's diary still maintained positions of power in town, and, coincidentally or not, controlled access to documents that might contain crucial information about the St. Michael Foundation. Upon leaving the town hall, Thomas decided to make an unscheduled visit to the current headquarters of Matthews Construction, located in a modern building on the outskirts of the historic town, one of the few contemporary constructions allowed in the region. The receptionist, a young woman of efficient appearance, informed him that Mr. Anthony Matthews had retired 5 years ago, leaving the business in the hands of his son, Claude, who accumulated the functions of businessman and municipal secretary. "Is Dr. Claude in the office today?" asked Thomas. "Unfortunately not, Father. He's in Richmond for a meeting with the state government. He'll be back only on Monday. Should I schedule an appointment for you?" "That won't be necessary. I'll return another time." As he left the building, Thomas noticed a dark car parked across the street. He had the distinct impression that the same vehicle had been in the vicinity of the town hall while he was researching. Coincidence, perhaps, but his instincts told him otherwise. On the way back to the church, he stopped at a small diner for a quick coffee. While waiting for his order, he leafed distractedly through a newspaper forgotten on the table. A small note in the local events section caught his attention. Charity auction promoted by the Pioneer Cultural Association. Among the items, historical relics donated by the Matthews family. Tomorrow 8 p.m. Independence Manor. The Pioneer Cultural Association. The name wasn't familiar to him, but the term pioneer immediately referred him to the logo of the St. Michael Foundation and its supposed historical compass rose. He decided he would go to the auction. If the Matthews family would be donating historical relics, perhaps he would find there a few more pieces of the puzzle. Upon returning to the church, he found Father Michael in a tense conversation with Mrs. Davis. The young priest seemed irritated, while the elderly woman maintained a firm posture despite her physical frailty. "Good that you're back, Father Thomas," said Mrs. Davis upon seeing him. "I was explaining to Father Michael that Clementine isn't just a common animal, but he refuses to listen." "I respect your age and devotion, ma'am," replied Michael with barely disguised impatience. "But I cannot tolerate superstitions that compromise the dignity of the church. A buffalo is not a divine messenger." "Nobody said divine messenger," retorted the elderly woman, "but there are more mysteries between heaven and earth than our vain philosophy supposes, as Shakespeare said." "Thank you, Mrs. Davis," intervened Thomas. "I appreciate your concern and respect your wisdom. Father Michael and I will continue this conversation later." After the lady left, Michael turned to Thomas with a severe expression. "Bishop Arnold called me today. He's very concerned about the rumors about the buffalo. He thinks it's making the parish a laughingstock. He'll come personally next week to evaluate the situation." "Tell Bishop Arnold I'll be available," replied Thomas calmly. "But also tell him that I won't take any action against the animal. It doesn't pose any danger." "You're letting yourself be carried away by fantasies, Father Thomas. That sincerely worries me." When Michael walked away, Thomas felt the weight of Lucy's diary in the inside pocket of his jacket. The discoveries of that day, pointed to something much bigger than superstitions about a mysterious buffalo. There was a scheme operating in the shadows of the historic town, something that involved powerful figures, ancient symbols, and secrets buried under the respectable mantle of philanthropy. And somehow, Lucy Montgomery had stumbled upon this secret. What had really happened to her? And why, after so many years, had Clementine or Thomas appeared to unearth the past? At dusk, as the golden light of the setting sun bathed the colonial houses of Oldbrook, Thomas caught sight of Clementine calmly grazing near the cemetery behind the church. He approached the animal slowly. "Who are you, really?" he whispered. "And what do you want me to discover?" The buffalo raised its head, its deep eyes reflecting the orange of the sunset. Unhurriedly, it began to walk toward a secluded area of the cemetery, occasionally stopping to check if the priest was following. Thomas understood the silent invitation. Whatever the truth behind that mystery, the next step of his journey was about to be revealed. The cemetery adjoining St. Jerome's Church was a small and ancient burial ground where generations of Oldbrook residents rested under tombstones worn by time. Century-old cypresses projected elongated shadows at the end of that afternoon, while Clementine guided Father Thomas among tombs and mausoleums. The animal moved with purpose, as if it knew exactly its destination. It finally stopped in front of a more remote area, where simpler and older graves clustered in an almost forgotten corner of the cemetery. Clementine began to scrape the ground with her hoof, pointing to a tombstone almost completely covered by moss and vines. It was a simple stone, without ornaments, clearly neglected for years. Thomas knelt and began to carefully clean the vegetation that covered it. As the moss was removed, engraved letters began to appear. The priest's heart accelerated when he managed to distinguish the first letters. L.M. Lucy Montgomery. With trembling fingers, he continued cleaning the stone until he revealed the complete inscription: Lucy Marie Montgomery, 968-1994. The truth shall set you free. Thomas felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. Lucy hadn't disappeared, as everyone thought. She was there, buried in the cemetery of the very church where she had worked, a few meters from where people passed daily without knowing. "My God," whispered the priest, making the sign of the cross. She never left Oldbrook. Examining the tombstone more carefully, he noticed something strange. There was no official burial record, no numbering or parish registration engraved on the stone, as was customary. It was as if that tomb had been placed surreptitiously, without the necessary formalities. While inspecting the base of the tombstone, his fingers found an irregularity in the stone, a small cavity disguised as a natural defect. Pressing lightly, he heard a click, and a part of the base moved, revealing a hidden compartment. With his heart pounding, Thomas reached into the hideaway and removed two objects: a silver rosary darkened by time and an aged paper envelope, protected by a plastic wrapper. He opened the envelope with extreme care. Inside, he found black and white photographs and typewritten documents. The photos showed the interior of St. Jerome's Church during the 1994 renovation, focusing on the floor raised under the altar. In one of them, the circular symbol was clearly visible, carved into the original stone. Another photograph showed three men gathered around a table. He immediately recognized Father Vincent, younger, alongside Anthony Matthews, and another man, who appeared to be the mayor at the time. On the table, documents and what looked like an old map. The typewritten papers were even more revealing. They were copies of contracts between the St. Michael Foundation and a foreign company called Heritage Preservation International. The contracts mentioned archaeological excavations and recovery of historical artifacts of inestimable value for private preservation. A specific paragraph caught his attention. The Foundation commits to locate and recover the artifact known as the Staff of Two Truths, following the map and indications provided by the contractor. Financial compensation will be deposited in the account in the Cayman Islands as agreed, after confirmation of the artifact's authenticity. A yellowed post-it note with handwriting that Thomas recognized from Lucy's diary was attached to the last page. "They aren't preserving our history, they're selling it. The staff doesn't belong to collectors." According to legend, it has the power to reveal hidden truths, expose lies. That's why they want it so badly. And that's why I need to find it first." Clementine snorted softly, as if hurrying the priest. The sun was almost setting, and the darkness was rapidly advancing through the cemetery. "You knew this all along," murmured Thomas to the buffalo. "You brought me here so I could find the evidence." A noise among the tombs made him rise quickly, storing the documents and the rosary in his pocket along with the diary. He saw a figure moving among the shadows, but it soon disappeared. Someone had been watching him. "We need to get out of here," he whispered to Clementine. Upon returning to the parish house, Thomas found an envelope without a return address that had been slipped under his door. Inside, a single sheet with a typed message. "Stop searching. Some truth should remain buried for everyone's good. This is your only warning." Instead of frightening him, the threat only strengthened his determination. If someone was willing to intimidate him, it was because there was something really important to be discovered. The next morning, Saturday, Thomas woke up early and decided to visit Lucy's house again. He needed to look for more clues about the so-called staff of two truths mentioned in the documents. When he arrived at Blossom Street, however, he was greeted by a sight that froze his blood. The blue house was in flames. Firefighters worked frenetically to control the fire, while curious onlookers gathered on the sidewalks. "What happened?" he asked a neighbor. "Started before dawn, Father. They say it was a short circuit, but the house had been abandoned for a year. Years didn't even have electricity." Thomas observed the flames consuming what remained of the property with the certainty that this was no accident. Someone wanted to destroy any evidence that might still be hidden in that house. "Father Thomas," a female voice called him. It was Mrs. Davis, standing across the street with a distressed expression. "We need to talk, not here." He followed her to a small cafe a few blocks away. The place was almost empty at that time of morning, allowing a private conversation. "I saw you yesterday in the cemetery," confessed the elderly woman as soon as they sat down. "I was bringing flowers to my husband and saw you with Clementine near Lucy's grave." "So you knew she was buried there?" Mrs. Davis lowered her eyes, wrinkled fingers nervously squeezing the crochet purse in her lap. "I always knew. I was the one who helped place the tombstone in the dead of night. Father Vincent said it needed to be this way, that there could be no ceremony or official record." "Why?" "He said that Lucy had taken her own life due to emotional problems, and that this was a sin that prevented her from receiving the final blessings. He said it was better for the family, for her reputation." "And you believed that?" The elderly woman raised her, teary eyes to face him. "Never. Lucy was a cheerful young woman, full of life and faith. We had talked the day before. She was anxious, yes, but not depressed. She said she had discovered something important and needed my help to do the right thing. We scheduled to meet on Friday after the novena, but she never showed up." "And what did you do?" "I went to her house, but there was no one. On Sunday, Father Vincent discreetly announced that she had gone away to take care of a sick aunt in another city. 2 months later, he approached me at night, asking for help to place the tombstone. He said she had decided to return but suffered an accident on the way and requested in her will to be buried here without fanfare." Thomas absorbed the information, feeling a tightness in his chest. "And you never questioned this story?" "I did question it, but at that time I was just a widow without influence. I went to the police once, but the sheriff was the mayor's cousin and said there was nothing to investigate. Over time I learned to keep my suspicions to myself. Old Brook is a small town, Father. Important people protect each other." "And what about Thomas? Did you know someone by that name connected to Lucy?" Mrs. Davis's expression lit up with recognition. "Thomas, of course. That's what she called that buffalo she raised on a small farm on the outskirts of town. A docile animal that followed her like a puppy. Lucy had rescued it as a calf from a slaughterhouse truck. When what happened, the animal disappeared. I thought it had been sold or—" The elderly woman interrupted herself, sudden understanding altering her expression. "My God, Father, Clementine is Thomas, after all these years?" "It seems so, Mrs. Davis. and he has returned to reveal the truth. The elderly woman placed her trembling hand on his. Be careful, Father. The people who did that to Lucy are still around, still have power. This fire wasn't an accident, they're erasing tracks. Why now, after so many years? Maybe because something is about to happen. I heard that the Matthews family is organizing a big event at Independence Manor tonight. An antiques auction for historical heritage preservation. The same words they used at the time of the St. Michael Foundation. The auction. Thomas had seen the announcement in the newspaper. Perhaps it was more than coincidence. Mrs. Davis, do you know anything about an artifact called the Staff of Two Truths? The elderly woman made the sign of the cross, eyes wide. My grandmother used to tell stories about it, a relic from colonial times, supposedly brought by Jesuits. According to legend, whoever possessed it could not be deceived. The staff would make every lie be revealed. They say it was hidden somewhere in Oldbrook during the Revolutionary War to protect it from the British Crown. And do you think this could be real? In this town, Father, the line between legend and reality has always been thin. Our ancestors hid gold in false walls, documents in false bottoms of drawers, secrets in underground tunnels. It wouldn't surprise me if the staff really existed. When they parted, Thomas had made his decision. He would go to the auction that night. If the Staff of Two Truths really existed, and if the St. Michael Foundation had tried to find it in the past, it was possible that the Matthews family had continued the search over the years, and perhaps, just perhaps, they were about to complete what they had begun decades ago, to sell a historical and spiritual treasure that didn't belong to them. Upon returning to the church, he found Father Michael waiting for him with a grave expression. Bishop Arnold has moved up his visit. He arrives early tomorrow. He paused, carefully observing Thomas's face. You look haggard. Has something happened? Just fatigue, Father Michael, he replied evasively. We have a lot of work to prepare for the bishop's arrival. As Michael walked away, Thomas saw Clementine observing him from the hill behind the A church. The midday sun illuminated her imposing silhouette, transforming her almost into a mystical apparition. The buffalo seemed to be telling him, in her silent language, that time was running out, and that the truth, buried for so long, finally, needed to come to light. Independence Manor was one of the most imposing constructions in Oldbrook. Built in the 18th century to house one of the conspirators of the American Revolution, the two-story mansion, with a Baroque-style facade, had been the stage for important historical events. Now restored and transformed into a cultural center, it served as a setting for exclusive events of the local elite. Father Thomas observed his own image in the mirror. He had exchanged his clerical attire for a discreet black suit. He didn't want to draw attention as a priest that night. He needed to circulate freely, observe and listen without arousing suspicion. Are you going out, Father? Asked Samuel, surprised to see him dressed that way. I have a private engagement, Samuel. If anyone looks for me, say I'll be back later. The old sacristan looked uncomfortable. Father Michael has been asking where you keep the old parish documents. He said Bishop Arnold requested a complete inventory. And what did you tell him? That only you know the exact location of all the archives. He wasn't pleased. Thomas nodded, silently thanking the sacristan for his loyalty. Keep an eye on the sacristy tonight, Samuel. Don't let anyone touch the archives until I return. When he arrived at Independence Manor, Thomas was impressed by the sumptuousness of the event. Waiters in period costumes served champagne in crystal flutes, while the guests, the cream of local society and collectors from various parts of the country, circulated admiring the items to be auctioned, displayed in illuminated showcases. He had obtained his invitation through Martha, the town hall archivist, who owed him some favors. He presented himself at the entrance as Professor Thomas Anderson, researcher of religious history, a half-truth that no one questioned. While discreetly examining the items on display, colonial paintings, antique silver, historical documents, on parchment, He tried to locate something that might be related to the staff of Two Truths or the St. Michael Foundation. "Professor Anderson, isn't it?" A female voice interrupted his reflections. He turned to find an elegant woman of approximately 40 years, impeccably arranged brown hair, and a perceptive gaze behind gold-framed glasses. "Yes, and you are." "Helen Matthews. This is my house, or rather my family's." She extended her hand in a firm greeting. "I don't recall seeing your name on the guest list." "I was invited at the last minute by Martha Reynolds from the town hall. I'm a researcher in the field of colonial, religious artifacts." Helen's gaze became more intense, almost inquisitive. "Fascinating. And what did you think of our modest collection?" "Impressive. Your family must have dedicated generations to gathering these pieces." "My father, mainly. Anthony Matthews was always passionate about the history of Old Brook. A pity he can't be here tonight. He's been hospitalized for a few months." Thomas felt a twinge of irony in fate. The man who probably knew the whole truth about Lucy Montgomery was out of reach. "I'm sorry. I hope he recovers soon." "I highly doubt it," replied Helen with surprising coldness. "Advanced stage Alzheimer's. He barely recognizes his own family." A gong sounded, announcing the beginning of the auction. The guests headed to the main hall, where chairs had been arranged. In a semicircle in front of a small stage, Thomas chose a discreet place in the last rows. The auctioneer, a man with rapid speech and theatrical gestures, began the event with enthusiasm. The first items, paintings, antique furniture, porcelain, were quickly sold. Thomas observed, attentively, less interested in the objects than in the people who were bidding. He noted the presence of Claude Matthews, Anthony's son and Helen's brother, seated in the first row. Tall and with a severe expression, he occasionally consulted his watch as if waiting for something specific. "Item number 27, announced the auctioneer. "An exceptional rarity, ladies and gentlemen, a Jesuit manuscript from the 17th century describing religious artifacts brought to America during colonization. Opening bid, $50,000. Thomas straightened in his chair. The manuscript, displayed on a giant screen for everyone to see the details, contained illustrations of various objects. Among them, he recognized what appeared to be the Staff of Two Truths, an ornate staff with engraved symbols, including the same circle with intricate lines he had seen under the altar of the church. The bids rose quickly. Collectors and museum representatives avidly competed for the item. When the value reached $200,000, only two interested parties remained. An elderly gentleman whom Thomas didn't know, and surprisingly, someone who was bidding by phone, represented by Helen Matthews. $300,000. "Dollars on the phone," announced the auctioneer with excitement. "Any other bid?" The elderly man shook his head, giving up. The manuscript was sold to the mysterious buyer on the phone. During the intermission that followed, Thomas tried to circulate discreetly to hear conversations. Near the bar, he caught a dialogue between Claude Matthews and a well-dressed man he didn't recognize. "The manuscript was just the beginning," Claude was saying in a low voice. "The representative from Zurich guarantees that, with the coordinates confirmed, we can finalize the operation this week." "And the priest," I heard. "He's been asking inconvenient questions." "He's being monitored. If he continues meddling, we'll have to take more direct measures." Thomas moved away before they could notice him. The mention of coordinates and representative from Zurich confirmed his suspicions. The search for the staff continued, and some foreign buyer was involved. Upon returning to the hall for the second part of the auction, he noticed something he hadn't perceived before. A small symbol discreetly embroidered on the stage curtains, the same circle with intricate lines he had seen so many times. And then he understood. Independence Manor must be one of the points marked on the map mentioned in the St. Michael Foundation documents. The auction was proceeding when Thomas felt his cell phone vibrate. It was a message from Samuel. "Return. Urgently. They found something in the church. Father Michael called the police." Alarmed, Thomas stood up to leave discreetly. At the door of the hall, however, he was intercepted by Helen Matthews. "Leaving so early, Professor? The most interesting part of the auction is yet to come." An emergency, unfortunately. I appreciate your hospitality." She smiled, but her eyes remained cold as ice. "What a pity. I was hoping to show you something special from our private collection. Perhaps another time." "Certainly," he replied, trying to maintain his composure. "Ah, Professor, or should I say Father Thomas?" The blood froze in his veins. Helen moved closer, speaking almost in his ear. "My brother Claude called Bishop Arnold this afternoon. Apparently you have shown an unusual interest in the St. Michael Foundation. Historical curiosity, I presume?" "As I said, I study the religious history of the region," he responded, maintaining his composure. "History is fascinating, isn't it? Especially when it remains in the past where it should stay." Helen's smile became predatory. "I suggest you focus on the living, Father. The dead already have their own problems." The veiled threat was unmistakable. Thomas nodded briefly and continued his way to the exit, feeling Helen's gaze burning on his back. Upon reaching the street, he realized he was being followed. A man in a dark suit had left right after him and was now watching him from across the street. He decided not to go directly to the church. Instead, he mingled with tourists who were still wandering through the historic streets on that Saturday night. After some maneuvers to lose the pursuer, he managed to reach an alley he knew well, a narrow passage that connected two main streets, through an old colonial tunnel. As he emerged on the other side, to his surprise, he found Clementine patiently waiting for him. "How do you always know where to find me?" he whispered, approaching the animal. Clementine moved her head in the direction of a side street as if indicating a path. Thomas understood. It wasn't safe to return to the church yet. The buffalo was offering him an alternative. "Show me where I should go," he murmured, caressing the animal's muzzle. As he followed Clementine through the less illuminated streets of Oldbrook, Thomas reflected on what he had discovered at the auction. The Matthews family was clearly still involved in the search for the staff. The manuscript sold probably contained crucial information to locate it. And, more disturbingly, they knew he was investigating the matter and were willing to stop him. Samuel's message also worried him. What had they found in the church? And why had Father Michael called the police? Clementine led him through increasingly narrow and deserted alleys, moving away from the historic center. Finally, they stopped in front of a slope, where the entrance to an abandoned old mine could be seen, partially covered by vegetation. The buffalo looked at him significantly and took a few steps toward the dark entrance. The message was clear. Inside was something that Thomas needed to see. "You want me to go in there? Now in the dark?" Clementine snorted softly, as if in confirmation. Thomas hesitated, but the trust he had developed in the animal's judgment over the past few days overcame his fear. He turned on his cell phone flashlight and, after a brief silent prayer, entered the darkness of the mine, with Clementine following closely. The air inside was humid and heavy, laden with the smell of earth and forgotten times. The limited beam of the flashlight illuminated a tunnel that extended for a few meters before opening into a wider chamber. On the stone walls, Thomas recognized with a start the same circular symbol carved with precision into the rock. It wasn't just one. There were dozens of them, forming a pattern that seemed to indicate a direction. In the center of the chamber, a structure similar to a rustic altar rose from the packed earth floor. And upon it, carefully wrapped in an ancient fabric that was falling apart at the touch, rested something that made Thomas's heart race. The Staff of Two Truths. The staff rested on the improvised altar like a jewel forgotten by time. Even in the precarious illumination of the flashlight, Thomas could perceive its extraordinary beauty. Made of a dark, gleaming wood, it measured approximately 3 feet in length, with intricate carvings throughout its extension. At the upper end, the same circular symbol that had become so familiar to Thomas in recent days appeared in relief, inlaid with small stones that reflected the light like vigilant eyes. With trembling hands, the priest touched the artifact. A strange sensation ran through his body, not exactly a shock but a kind of recognition, as if the staff responded to his presence. "This is what Lucy found," he whispered to Clementine, who was observing the scene with solemn attention. "This is what she hid here, away from those who wanted to sell it." Examining the object more carefully in the flashlight's beam, Thomas noticed inscriptions engraved in the wood. They seemed to be in ancient Latin, mixed with symbols he didn't recognize. A phrase near the base of the staff, however, was in archaic English and still legible. "He who wields this staff shall see beyond the words of men, shall distinguish truth from falsehood, and no lie shall remain hidden in his presence." Thomas felt a shiver. If the legend was true, he was before an object with extraordinary power. Not a magical or supernatural power, perhaps, but a symbol so powerful that its mere presence compelled people to honesty. It was easy to imagine why collectors and influential people would be willing to pay fortunes for it, and why others would do anything to keep it hidden. "You knew all along where it was," he said to Clementine, finally understanding. "You helped Lucy hide it here." The buffalo, slightly, lowered its head as if in assent. Thomas was still marveling at the animal's intelligence, at its unwavering loyalty even after so many years. There was something almost supernatural in this devotion that transcended time and the limitations of animal nature. A sudden current of air stirred the dust on the floor of the cave, making the flame of a candle, which Thomas hadn't noticed, burst or flicker on the opposite wall. The priest cautiously approached and discovered a small cavity in the rock, similar to a niche. Inside, besides the partially consumed candle, there was a yellowed envelope. Carefully, Thomas opened the envelope and found a handwritten letter, the same handwriting as Lucy's diary. "To whoever finds the staff, if you're reading this, I'm probably no longer here. I managed to discover the location of this artifact through the documents of the St. Michael Foundation and understood that I needed to protect it. The Staff of Two Truths is not just a religious relic. It's a symbol of justice and transparency, which our ancestors hid so that it wouldn't be used as an instrument of power or commerce. The St. Michael Foundation, despite its charity facade, was created with the sole purpose of locating and selling historical artifacts to international collectors. Father Vincent, whom I trusted for years, is involved up to his neck in this scheme, along with contractor Anthony Matthews and figures from the municipal government. I discovered that they have already sold various relics from the churches of Oldbrook, replacing them with replicas. The money never reached the social works they claim to support. It went to offshore accounts in the names of the Foundation's directors. The staff was their biggest prize, negotiated for millions with a Swiss collector. When I realized what was happening, I made copies of the documents and confronted Father Vincent. He pretended remorse and promised to close the Foundation, but I later discovered it was a lie. They continued looking for the staff and began to threaten me. Fortunately, I found the artifact before them, guided by the symbols that are scattered throughout Oldbrook, a kind of map left by the Jesuits who brought the staff from Europe. Thomas helped me. He always had a special instinct for finding paths where no one else saw passage. We hid the staff here, where I believe it will be safe until the right person finds it. I just hope that person understands its true purpose and doesn't yield to the temptation to use it for personal benefit or sell it. I fear for my safety now. I know too much. If something happens to me, the evidence against the St. Michael Foundation is in a dossier that I hid in the base of my tombstone. Yes, I even prepared my own grave. Such is my mistrust. It seems morbid, but it's just precaution. If you found this letter and the staff, please make the truth come to light. Not for vengeance, but for justice, so that Oldbrook knows its true history, and so that our heritage is preserved as a collective good, not as merchandise. May God guide and protect you. Lucy Marie Montgomery, August 12, 1994. Thomas folded the letter with reverence, feeling the weight of the responsibility he had just assumed. Lucy's sacrifice could not be in vain. The truth needed to be revealed, no matter how painful it might be. A sudden noise at the entrance of the mine startled him. Clementine also noticed, her ears moving in attention. Voices were approaching, accompanied by the beam of flashlights, more powerful than Thomas's cell phone. It must be around here. The GPS indicates the priest is in this area. Thomas recognized the voice. It was one of the men who were with Claude Matthews at the auction. Somehow they had managed to track him. "Thomas," he whispered to the buffalo, intentionally using the animal's original name, "we need to get out of here. Is there another exit?" Clementine moved to the back of the chamber, where a narrow, almost imperceptible passage opened between the rocks. Thomas took the staff, put Lucy's letter in his pocket, and followed the animal, bending over to pass through the opening. The tunnel was tight and low, forcing the priest to crawl in some stretches. Clementine, impressively, managed to squeeze through spaces that seemed impossible for her size, more evidence of her extraordinary nature. After what seemed like an eternity crawling in the darkness, Thomas felt a fresh breeze. The tunnel opened onto a slope on the other side of the hill, completely covered by vegetation. From there they could see the lights of Oldbrook in the distance. "They must have monitored my cell phone," murmured Thomas, turning off the device to avoid further tracking. "We need to get to the church before them." Guided by Clementine, who seemed to know every trail and shortcut in the region, the priest descended the hill through paths that certainly dated from the colonial period, secret passages used by escaped slaves or revolutionaries persecuted by the British government. As they walked, Thomas couldn't help but contemplate the staff he was carrying. In the darkness of night, the small stones inlaid in the circular symbol seemed to emit their own glow, subtle but undeniable. Perhaps it was just the reflection of the moon, or perhaps there was something more in that ancient object, some property, that modern science couldn't easily explain. They arrived at the back of the church around 11 at night. Thomas was alarmed to see several police cars parked in front of the temple, their rotating lights projecting blue and red shadows on the colonial walls. "Stay here," he murmured to Clementine, hiding the staff under the jacket he wore over his suit. As he approached the side entrance, he was intercepted by Samuel, who seemed distressed. "Thank God you've arrived, Father. They're all crazy looking for you." "What happened, Samuel? Why is the police here?" Father Michael found something under the altar, or rather, he already knew what to look for. He removed part of the floor and showed the police a hidden compartment. "There were old documents in there, Father, and a gun." "A gun? What kind of gun?" "An old pistol. And the worst, it had your name engraved on a paper attached to it. Father Michael said that you had been investigating Lucy Montgomery's disappearance and suggested that you might be involved somehow." Thomas felt his blood freeze. It was a trap, clearly set up to incriminate him. "Where is everyone now?" "In the sacristy. Sheriff Matthews is there. He's Claude and Helen Matthews' cousin. There's also a representative from the diocese who arrived a short while ago. They're talking about crime, exhumation, all sorts of things. Father Michael showed them the diary he found among your belongings." "My God," murmured Thomas. "He searched my quarters and took Lucy's diary." At that moment, Father Michael appeared at the side door, accompanied by 2 police officers. His young face displayed a thinly disguised expression of triumph. "There he is," he announced. "Father Thomas, the sheriff needs to ask you some questions about your involvement in the Lucy Montgomery case, and about what was hidden under the altar of the church." Thomas felt the weight of the staff under his jacket. It was the hour of truth, literally. If the legend was real, perhaps this was exactly what he needed now, an instrument that compelled everyone to speak only the truth. "I'm at your disposal," he replied with a calm he didn't feel. "I have a lot to say about this case, more than you imagine." As he was led inside the church, he saw from the corner of his eye that Clementine was observing everything from a strategic point at the back of the grounds. The buffalo's gaze conveyed a clear message: trust. It was as if the animal knew that with the staff in hand, Thomas now had the power to make the truth, buried for so long, finally come to light. And in the sacristy, where representatives of the law, the church, and the influential Matthews family awaited him, the priest prepared himself for the confrontation that could forever change not only his life, but the entire recent history of Oldbrook. The sacristy of St. Jerome's Church, normally a space of silence and spiritual preparation, had been transformed into an improvised interrogation room. Upon entering, Thomas found a group of people waiting for him, with expressions ranging from curiosity to declared hostility. Sheriff Richard Matthews, a corpulent, middle-aged man with a well-trimmed mustache, sat behind the desk that usually served for signing the baptism book. At his side, Father Michael maintained a rigid posture, his hands crossed over his lap as if in forced prayer. Helen Matthews was positioned near the window, as if wanting to maintain a certain distance from the scene. At the other end of the room, a man in a dark suit whom Thomas didn't know observed everything with a neutral, almost clinical expression. Completing the group, to Thomas's surprise, Bishop Arnold, who supposedly would only arrive the next day, occupied a side chair, his grave countenance accentuated by the yellowish light of the candles. "Father Thomas Anderson," began the sheriff, pointing to an empty chair in front of the desk. "Please sit down." Thomas obeyed, feeling the weight of the staff hidden under his jacket. He decided to keep it concealed for now, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. "Do you know why we're here?" continued the sheriff, leafing through a folder with documents. "I believe so. Apparently, I've been accused of something related to Lucy Montgomery, a woman who disappeared almost 30 years ago." "Not just disappeared, Father," intervened Father Michael, his tone laden with theatrical indignation. "The evidence suggests that she was assaulted and held against her will." "And what evidence would that be?" asked Thomas calmly. The sheriff pushed forward an old pistol inside a transparent plastic bag. This weapon was found in a secret compartment under the altar of the church, along with incriminating documents related to the St. Michael Foundation. And this diary, he held up the leather-bound notebook that Thomas immediately recognized, was found among your personal belongings. It belonged to Miss Montgomery and contains serious accusations against figures in the community, including the former pastor of this church. And how does that incriminate me exactly? You have shown an obsessive interest in the case in recent days, asking questions, invading abandoned properties, even attending a Matthews family auction in disguise. Now we discover that you hid crucial evidence instead of bringing it to the authorities. Thomas breathed deeply, organizing his thoughts. The moment required absolute clarity and precision. "Sheriff Matthews, I didn't hide anything. I discovered this diary only 3 days ago, in the house that belonged to Lucy Montgomery. A house, by the way, that mysteriously caught fire this morning, destroying potential evidence." Helen Matthews moved uncomfortably in her corner, but didn't say anything. "As for the gun," continued Thomas, "I've never seen it before. Anyone could have placed it there, especially considering that the compartment under the altar was exposed recently when Clementine, the buffalo that has been visiting the church, revealed the symbol carved in the original floor." "Ah, yes, the famous buffalo," said the sheriff with sarcasm. "A convenient distraction for this whole situation, don't you think? Almost as if someone had trained the animal to create a spectacle while other matters happened behind the scenes." "Richard," intervened Bishop Arnold, speaking for the first time, "let's stick to the concrete facts. Father Thomas, your conduct in recent days has been, at the very least, irregular. Absenting yourself from your duties, investigating on your own a possible criminal case, concealing relevant information. All these are serious violations of your responsibility as a pastor. With all due respect, Bishop Arnold, my investigation began only after Clementine appeared in the church and revealed the symbol under the altar. It was she who led me to Lucy's grave, where I found documents that prove the existence of a scheme of trafficking historical artifacts involving the St. Michael Foundation." At the mention of the grave, Thomas noticed a brief glance exchanged between Helen and the sheriff. "What grave?" asked Father Michael, with evident surprise. "Lucy Montgomery was never buried here. On the contrary, her grave is at the back of the church cemetery, hidden by vegetation. The tombstone was placed secretly, probably to conceal the true circumstances of her departure." The man in the suit, who had remained silent until then, took a step forward. "That's a very serious accusation, Father. Are you suggesting a cover-up of crime by the church?" "I'm stating, sir." Dr. Fisher, public prosecutor. "I'm stating, Dr. Fisher, that Lucy Montgomery discovered a scheme of corruption and contraband of historical artifacts involving the St. Michael Foundation, which was presided over by Anthony Matthews and had as its vice president Father Vincent, my predecessor." Helen Matthews finally broke her silence. "That's defamation. My father dedicated his life to preserving the historical heritage of Oldbrook. The St. Michael Foundation restored churches, revitalized monuments, and sold invaluable artifacts to foreign collectors, replacing them with replicas, completed Thomas, all documented in the papers that Lucy hid before her disappearance, papers that I found in the base of her tombstone. Where are those documents now? Demanded the sheriff. In a safe place, replied Thomas, deciding not to reveal that he was carrying them. Bishop Arnold sighed heavily. Father Thomas, you're basing yourself on suppositions and on writings of a woman who, for all we know, could have been mentally disturbed. This is not appropriate conduct for a pastor. And what about the buffalo? Asked the prosecutor. How do you explain its unusual behavior? It was at this moment that Thomas decided it was time to use the staff. Slowly, he removed the artifact from inside his jacket, revealing it to everyone in the room. The small stones inlaid in the circular symbol caught the candlelight, casting golden reflections on the walls of the sacristy. What is that? Asked Bishop Arnold, leaning forward to see better. This, Bishop Arnold, is the staff of two truths. The artifact that the St. Michael Foundation was so eagerly seeking. The object that Lucy found before them and hid to protect from smugglers. Helen visibly paled. That's impossible. The staff is just a legend. It's not a legend, Mrs. Matthews. It's as real as the interest your family continues to have in it, as real as the auction tonight, where a manuscript containing information about its location was sold to a mysterious buyer on the phone. That's just a piece of carved wood, disdained the sheriff, but his voice betrayed an unusual nervousness. If it's just a piece of wood, why was your cousin Claude Matthews willing to pay millions to obtain it? Why would a Swiss collector be interested? Why would the St. Michael Foundation have gone to the trouble of creating an entire scheme to locate it? You don't understand anything, shot Helen, her veneer of sophistication beginning to crack. Some artifacts are too valuable to be displayed in local museums without adequate security. We're talking about preservation in the best possible institution. You speak of preservation, Mrs. Matthews, but the only trace that remained of these artifacts are the millions in offshore accounts in your family's name. It's all in the documents that Lucy copied before her disappearance. A dense tension filled the sacristy. Bishop Arnold seemed genuinely confused, while Father Michael looked increasingly uncomfortable. And what about Clementine? Or rather, Thomas? Asked the prosecutor, visibly intrigued. The buffalo that has been coming to the church, what is its relation to all this? Thomas firmly held the staff, feeling a strange energy emanate from it. Thomas was Lucy's pet buffalo. She rescued it as a calf, and they developed a special bond. It was he who helped her hide the staff, and it's he who has guided me through this entire investigation. Are you suggesting that an animal maintained a mission for almost 30 years? The sheriff ironically asked. That's absurd. No more absurd than an old pistol conveniently appearing under the altar with my name attached, Sheriff. Or Lucy's house catching fire exactly when I began asking the right questions, or even Father Michael searching my quarters in my absence. The young priest intensely blushed. I had orders from Bishop Arnold to check on your well-being. I gave no such order, retorted the bishop, surprising everyone. A heavy silence fell over the room. Thomas realized that something had changed in the dynamics of the confrontation. The alliances and motivations were beginning to become clearer. Bishop Arnold, asked Thomas, when exactly did you arrive in Oldbrook? Father Michael mentioned that you would only come tomorrow. I received an urgent phone call from Claude Matthews this afternoon, mentioning possible irregularities in your parish. I decided to move up my visit. And you, Dr. Fisher, what brings a public prosecutor to a simple parish conversation on a Saturday night? The prosecutor adjusted his glasses, appearing slightly embarrassed. I was also contacted by Claude Matthews. He mentioned a possible case of concealment of crime and desecration of a grave. Everything was beginning to make sense. The Matthews family had orchestrated that meeting, bringing authority figures to give credibility to the accusations against him, while trying to recover the staff in parallel. Sheriff, said Thomas, rising slowly with the staff in hand, I suggest that you investigate not me but Lucy Montgomery's grave. I suggest that you compare the fingerprints on that gun not only with mine, but also with Father Michael's, who curiously knew exactly where to look under the altar. And I suggest, above all, that you examine the documents I found and that clearly show the involvement of the St. Michael Foundation in illegal activities. As if responding to an invisible call, the sacristy door suddenly opened. To everyone's amazement, Clementine calmly entered the room, her hooves resonating on the stone floor. The animal walked directly to the center of the room and stopped beside Thomas, facing those present with those deep and wise eyes. "Get that animal away," demanded Helen, backing against the wall. "Why, Mrs. Matthews? Do you fear what it represents? Do you fear that it's living proof that Lucy Montgomery didn't disappear voluntarily, but was silenced because she knew too much?" The sheriff rose abruptly. "Enough. I'm going to arrest you for obstruction of justice, Father, and seize this supposed artifact as evidence." When he took a step in Thomas's direction, however, Clementine moved to block his path, snorting in a threatening manner for the first time since she had appeared in the church. The moment of tension was interrupted by a new arrival. Mrs. Davis entered the sacristy leaning on her cane, followed by Samuel and, to everyone's surprise, by Dr. Mitchell, the retired veterinarian. "What's happening here?" questioned the elderly woman with surprising authority. "Are you accusing Father Thomas of something? Because if you are, then you should accuse me too. I was the one who helped place Lucy's tombstone in the cemetery at Father Vincent's request." "Mrs. Davis," warned the sheriff, "you shouldn't be here." "On the contrary, Richard, I should have been here a long time ago. Years ago, when I realized that the story about Lucy's disappearance didn't make sense. But I kept quiet, like so many others in this town." Dr. Mitchell stepped forward. "And I have something to add about Clementine, or rather, Thomas. I examined the animal last week, and I can state with certainty that it's at least 30 years old. It's the same buffalo that belonged to Lucy Montgomery, without a doubt." Helen Matthews seemed about to collapse. "This is madness. You're all delusional." "Or perhaps," intervened Bishop Arnold, who had observed everything with growing understanding, "perhaps we're finally facing the truth that has been buried for too long." The bishop stood up and walked to Thomas, examining the staff with reverence. "Is this really the staff of two truths, the artifact mentioned in the ancient Jesuit manuscripts?" "Yes, Bishop Arnold. I found it exactly where Lucy hid it, guided by Thomas." The bishop touched the object carefully. "If this is authentic, it belongs to the cultural and spiritual heritage not just of Oldbrook, but of all humanity." "Exactly what Lucy thought," agreed Thomas, "and that's why she refused to allow it to be sold to a private collection abroad." A noise at the door attracted everyone's attention. Claude Matthews was entering the sacristy, accompanied by two foreign-looking men. Upon seeing the staff in Thomas's hands, his face contorted into a mask of fury and despair. "You have no idea what you're doing, Father," he said through clenched teeth. "There's more at stake here than you can imagine." Thomas raised the staff and the candlelight seemed to intensify, reflecting in the small stones inlaid in the circular symbol. "On the contrary, Mr. Matthews, I think I understand perfectly what's at stake, and the time for truth has arrived." The sacristy of St. Jerome's Church, with its stone walls that had witnessed centuries of secrets and confessions, had never seemed so small as on that night. The heavy air of tension made the candle flames flicker, projecting dancing shadows that seemed like additional characters in the drama unfolding there. Claude Matthews advanced another step, his gaze fixed on the staff that Thomas was holding. The two men accompanying him, one short and stocky with Nordic features, the other tall and thin with a discreet French accent when murmuring something, remained near the door, like guards. "Father Thomas," Claude's voice sounded controlled, but with an underlying tension, "don't complicate matters. That artifact is too valuable to stay here. We have buyers willing to pay millions and guarantee its proper preservation." "Preservation in a private safe, you mean?" retorted Thomas, without releasing the staff. "Where no one will ever see it again, except the owner who will boast of possessing it." Helen Matthews approached her brother. "Claude, this has gone too far. Maybe we should reconsider." "Shut up, Helen." Claude's explosion surprised everyone. I won't give up when we're so close. We've already invested too much. Bishop Arnold intervened, his voice carrying the authority of decades of spiritual leadership. Mr. and Ms. Matthews, if this staff is authentic, it belongs to the cultural and religious heritage, not to private collectors. And if there were irregularities involving the church in the past, it's our moral and legal obligation to clarify everything now. Sheriff Richard Matthews, visibly uncomfortable with the direction of events, tried to reassume control of the situation. These are all speculations. We don't have concrete proof of anything. Actually, Sheriff, replied Thomas calmly, besides the documents I found, we have something even more valuable: witnesses. He indicated Mrs. Davis, Samuel, and Dr. Mitchell, who remained together in a corner of the sacristy. Mrs. Davis saw Father Vincent place the tombstone on Lucy's secret grave. Samuel witnessed suspicious conversations during the church renovations. And Dr. Mitchell can confirm that Clementine is the same buffalo that belonged to Lucy almost 30 years ago, an animal that inexplicably returned to reveal the truth. The taller man accompanying Claude took a step forward, speaking in English with a strong accent. Mr. Matthews, this is not what we came here for. Our client is interested in the artifact, not in legal complications. Claude shot him a furious look. Control yourself, Mr. Laurent. Prosecutor Dr. Fisher, who until then had been observing everything with growing attention, adjusted his glasses and addressed Thomas. Father, these documents you mention, if they really exist and contain evidence of illegal activities, they need to be handed over to the authorities immediately. And they will be, assured Thomas. But first we need to ensure that they'll be analyzed by impartial authorities, not compromised with the Matthews family. Sheriff Richard blushed intensely. Are you questioning my integrity? I'm acknowledging your family ties, Sheriff, and suggesting that, in this specific case, other eyes should examine the evidence. At that moment, to everyone's surprise, Father Michael stepped forward, his young face contorted by an expression of internal conflict. I need to say something, he announced, his voice trembling. I was instructed by Father Vincent before coming here. He told me where to find the gun under the altar and how to incriminate Father Thomas. A shocked murmur ran through the room. Why would you do that? Asked Bishop Arnold, visibly shaken. He said it was for the good of the church to avoid a bigger scandal. Michael lowered his eyes, ashamed. I only realized later that I was being used to protect interests that had nothing to do with faith or the institution. Helen Matthews let out a muffled sob, leaning against the nearest wall. This should never have happened. Lucy was my friend. What? Claude turned to his sister, stunned. We studied together, continued Helen, her facade of sophistication completely crumbling. When I found out what happened to her, I wanted to speak up, but Father convinced me it was an accident, that no one was to blame. Helen, shut up, ordered Claude. No, Claude, I've been quiet for too long, she turned to the others. Lucy discovered the Foundation's schemes and confronted Father Vincent and my father. There was an argument. She fell and hit her head. It was an accident, but instead of calling for help, they panicked and decided to cover everything up. The silence that followed was dense, laden with the implications of this confession. And the documents about the artifact trafficking? Asked the prosecutor. They're genuine, confirmed Helen. The St. Michael Foundation was created specifically for that. They used the church renovations as a pretext to access and replace valuable relics with replicas. The originals were sold to international collectors. Dr. Fisher quickly took notes, his role as prosecutor taking precedence over his initial presence as a guest of the Matthews. This is a confession of crime, ma'am. We're talking about smuggling, criminal association, and possibly involuntary manslaughter. It wasn't like that, protested Claude, his control finally breaking. That woman was threatening us, wanting to destroy everything we had built. Oldbrook's heritage was abandoned, deteriorating. We just ensured that the most valuable pieces were properly preserved. In private safes in Switzerland, questioned Thomas. Better than rotting in basements of museums without funding. Bishop Arnold sadly shook his head. Preservation doesn't justify theft, Mr. Matthews, nor abandoning ethics. Clementine, who had been observing everything with that solemn calm that characterized her, approached Helen Matthews, looking her fixedly in the eyes. The woman, to everyone's amazement, extended a trembling hand and touched the buffalo's muzzle. "You were there, weren't you?" she whispered. "You saw what happened to her." The buffalo maintained a steady gaze, as if silently confirming. The two foreigners accompanying Claude began to retreat discreetly toward the exit, but were barred by the arrival of 2 police officers, not from Sheriff Richard's team but from the federal police as indicated by their badges. "What is this?" demanded the sheriff. "It means," replied the older of the agents, "that we received an anonymous tip about international trafficking of cultural goods involving the Matthews family and the St. Michael Foundation. We came to investigate, and it seems we arrived at the right time." Thomas exchanged a glance with Mrs. Davis, who just smiled discreetly. The elderly woman had promised to take care of everything when they parted earlier. As the night progressed, the sacristy transformed into a scene of testimonies, arrests, and revelations. Claude Matthews, the foreign buyers, and Sheriff Richard were taken for formal interrogation. Helen, who collaborated completely, received more lenient treatment, although she also faced serious charges. Father Michael, after confessing his role in the conspiracy, was temporarily removed by Bishop Arnold, who assured that the young man would receive appropriate spiritual guidance to deal with his mistakes. It was already past midnight when the church finally emptied, leaving only Thomas, Bishop Arnold, Mrs. Davis, and naturally Clementine. The staff rested on the altar, its stones reflecting the candlelight like tiny stars. "What will happen now?" asked Mrs. Davis, observing the artifact with reverence. "The staff will be catalogued and studied," replied Bishop Arnold. "Its authenticity will be verified by experts. If confirmed, it will be displayed in an appropriate museum, where everyone can appreciate it and learn its history." "And what about Lucy?" The elderly woman's voice trembled slightly. "She'll receive a dignified funeral," assured Thomas, "with all the honors and prayers she deserves, and her name will be cleared, her courage recognized." Clementine approached the altar, observing the staff with what seemed to be satisfaction. Her mission, faithfully maintained for almost 3 decades, was finally completed. "What will happen with her?" asked Thomas, caressing the buffalo's muzzle. "Thomas?" smiled Mrs. Davis. "He can stay with me. I have a small backyard where he'll be safe and well cared for. I think he deserves a rest after so much dedication." The next morning, a clear Sunday with blue skies, St. Jerome's Church was packed for the Mass. The news of the previous night's events had spread quickly, attracting faithful, curious onlookers and journalists. Bishop Arnold presided over the celebration, with Father Thomas at his side. During the homily, the bishop spoke about truth, justice, and redemption. He mentioned the staff of 2 Truths not just as a historical artifact, but as a symbol of the commitment that everyone should have to honesty and transparency. "This church," he said, looking at the attentive congregation, "and this town have a rich and beautiful history, but also their shadows. What we have learned in recent days is that no secret remains buried forever, and that the truth, however painful it may be, is always the path to healing and reconciliation." After the Mass, while the faithful slowly dispersed, a figure stood out among the people approaching to greet the priest. It was an elderly man in a wheelchair, pushed by a nurse. His wrinkled face showed clear signs of a debilitated mind, but his eyes still carried a momentary lucidity. "Father," said the nurse, "this is Anthony Matthews. He insisted on coming, even against medical orders. He said he needed to talk to you." Thomas approached the wheelchair, bending down to be at eye level with the old man. "Mr. Matthews." "Father," the voice was weak but determined. "Is she here? Is Lucy here?" "No, Mr. Matthews, but soon we'll give her the appropriate rest." The elderly man nodded slowly, tears forming in his clouded eyes. "It was an accident. We never wanted. I never intended." "I know," replied Thomas softly. "The staff," she was right about it. It wasn't just a valuable object. It was a symbol, a reminder. His words came with difficulty, as if emerging from a mental fog. Some truths shouldn't be sold. No, they shouldn't. Anthony Matthews raised a trembling hand and held Thomas's arm. There are others, Father. Other artifacts. I have a list. In the house. In the safe behind my father's portrait. The password is the date of the revolution. The nurse made to move him away, concerned with his growing agitation, but Thomas asked her to wait. I'll hand the list to the authorities, Mr. Matthews. Perhaps it's still possible to recover some pieces. Thank you, whispered the old man, leaning back in the chair, apparently exhausted by the effort of bringing to light memories and guilt buried for so long. As the nurse took Anthony Matthews away, Thomas saw Clementine observing the scene from the entrance of the church. The buffalo maintained her dignified posture, her deep eyes following the stooped figure of the man who decades before had participated in the events that led to the loss of her beloved owner. Approaching the animal, Thomas caressed her robust neck. It's finished, Thomas. You fulfilled your promise to Lucy. The truth has come to light. And the staff is safe. As if perfectly understanding, the buffalo gently lowered her head, touching Thomas's chest with her moist muzzle. It was a gesture of farewell, the priest realized, not definitive, but the closure of a phase. In the following weeks, Oldbrook experienced a transformation. The official exhumation of Lucy Montgomery's body confirmed her identity and revealed the cause of her departure, a cranial trauma consistent with an accidental fall, exactly as Helen Matthews had described. Her funeral gathered hundreds of people, many of whom had only heard about her recently, but all touched by her courage and determination. The staff of Two Truths, after meticulous authentication by experts, was declared a national treasure, being installed in a permanent exhibition at the Revolutionary History Museum. The list provided by Anthony Matthews allowed the recovery of dozens of historical artifacts that had been smuggled to private collections abroad. A slow process, but one that represented the restoration of an important part of American cultural heritage. The St. Michael Foundation was officially investigated and dissolved, its remaining assets redirected to a new fund administered transparently, dedicated to the true preservation of the historical heritage of Virginia. As for Clementine, or Thomas, the buffalo lived its remaining days in Mrs. Davis's backyard, receiving frequent visits from Father Thomas and becoming a kind of unofficial mascot of the town. Children brought it carrots and apples, and the elderly told its story to visitors, mixing facts and elements of fable, as is proper to oral tradition. On an autumn afternoon, about a year after the events that shook Oldbrook, Thomas found himself alone in St. Jerome's Church, preparing for the evening mass. The circular symbol under the altar, now exposed as part of the temple's history, had been surrounded by a glass protection, allowing visitors to observe it without damaging it. While adjusting the flowers on the altar, the priest heard a familiar sound, hooves on stone echoing in the empty nave. He turned, expecting to see Thomas, who occasionally escaped from Mrs. Davis's backyard to visit the church. There was no one there, just the golden light of the setting sun, filtering through the stained glass and projecting a colorful mosaic on the stone floor. For a fleeting instant, Thomas was certain he saw two silhouettes in the light, one of an imposing buffalo, the other of a young woman with curly hair, both translucent as materialized memories. Then the vision dissipated, leaving only the serene peace of the church and the comforting certainty that some connections transcend rational explanations. Some loyalties survive time, and some truths, once revealed, can never be buried again.